He died thousands of miles from the streets that made him king. Not a soul came to claim his body. Not his brother. Not his blood-soaked allies. Not even the niece who once said she owed him her life. The nurse who cleaned his room that morning didn't know he once moved hundreds of kilos across oceans. She just wiped the floor and left, thinking he was another frail inmate in a foreign prison. She didn't know a man with half a nation's fear in his pocket had just taken his final breath. They say legends don't die quietly. But Álvaro Castillo, known in whispered tones as El Viejo, did. Shot twice in the chest by someone who once called him brother, Álvaro bled out in a corridor no wider than a market stall. There was no grand chase, no cartel war that followed. Just a name scratched off a list. And yet, in the small Colombian town he left behind, fireworks cracked the sky that night. Some mourned. Some danced. The man who built an empire on blood and powder was gone. But the silence he left behind? That was louder than any gunshot. This isn't just the story of a murder. It's the story of how power dies. Not with a scream. But with a whisper no one wanted to hear. Before Álvaro Castillo ever wore a gold watch, he was just another child swallowed by the jungle's silence. Born in 1949 in the forgotten edges of Florencia, Colombia, Álvaro came into a world that didn't keep records of boys like him. His father, barely a name, left early. His mother worked odd jobs until malaria took her. Álvaro was 11 when he buried her with his own hands. By 12, he had vanished from school registers, slipping instead into the quiet corridors of the coca trade. There was no ceremony to his entry. No grand initiation. He started as a lookout, skinny, sunburnt, fast. The kind of boy no one noticed until something went wrong. But Álvaro never let things go wrong. He watched. He learned. He waited. Others bragged about toughness. Álvaro delivered results. By 16 he was already fluent in the unspoken language of survival. He knew when to run, when to fight, and when to disappear. He didn't crave power. He craved control. There's a difference. Power is loud and temporary. Control is quiet and permanent. Álvaro understood that early. Through the late 70s, as Colombia's drug corridors exploded with violence and American dollars, Álvaro carved out a place not by force, but by consistency. He became a courier, then a manager, then a name. He formed alliances with the Medellin cartel, not because he loved their methods, but because he saw the direction history was taking. Pablo Escobar was teaching the country that fear could be monetized. Álvaro took notes, but built his own playbook. He never wanted to be the flashiest. He wanted to be the last man standing. By the early 90s, Álvaro had consolidated his grip over vast stretches of Quito. Entire villages owed their infrastructure to him. New schools, paved roads, clinics stocked with medicines no government had ever delivered. Locals whispered his name with a strange reverence, like speaking it too loudly might summon either a favor or a funeral. El Viejo, they called him. The old man. Not because he was old, but because he moved like someone who had already died once, and came back smarter. He dressed modestly. White guayaberas, polished shoes, a quiet watch. He didn't need the gold chains or loud cars. His presence did the talking. People in high places took his calls. Generals, judges, bankers, priests. If they couldn't be bought, they were avoided. If they couldn't be avoided, they disappeared. But his influence didn't stop at Colombia's borders. By 2000, Álvaro was managing international shipments so complex they rivaled state intelligence operations. Spanish ports received crates of bananas with cocaine vacuum sealed into the stems. Luxury yachts transported bricks hidden inside false fuel tanks. Eastern European banks laundered the proceeds, often unknowingly. His name was buried beneath a dozen aliases, and his network spanned 5 countries. In Spain he was rumored to own vineyards. In Portugal, a private airstrip. In Italy, apartments under other men's names. He moved money like water, fluid, traceless, essential. And yet, in Quito, he remained something else entirely. A provider. A myth. A contradiction. For every family he displaced, another was lifted. For every addict he created, another child had tuition paid in full. Álvaro didn't apologize for the blood. He considered it the cost of building something lasting in a land where nothing had lasted before. He believed deeply that he had saved more than he had destroyed. Not everyone agreed. Even within his ranks, envy festered. Marcelo Ortega, once a driver, then a bodyguard, then an enforcer, had risen quickly through loyalty. Álvaro had trusted him, perhaps too much. He gave Marcelo power, influence, even let him manage a branch of the European corridor. Marcelo basked in it. For a time. But what Álvaro gave he also monitored. When Marcelo began acting too independently, Álvaro cut his access. Gently at first, then publicly. Marcelo, once celebrated, became an errand boy again. He never forgot the humiliation. Meanwhile, Álvaro's niece, Beatriz Duarte, remained his most loyal defender. Raised in his household after her mother died, Beatriz had seen both sides of the man, his gentleness in private and his cold strategy in business. To her, Álvaro was a savior. She adored him the way some girls adored their fathers. He had given her education, protection, a name that carried weight. But Álvaro never believed in legacy. Not in the traditional sense. He didn't groom successors. He didn't trust blood to carry his empire. He trusted fear and loyalty, until both began to fail. And they did begin to fail. By the late 2000s, international agencies had compiled years of intelligence. Álvaro had dodged arrest multiple times. But he grew bolder, older, slower. A surveillance tip in Madrid, a sting at an airport in Seville. Finally he was caught. Extradited to Spain. Held in a guarded wing of a hospital due to his chronic heart issues. For the first time in decades, Álvaro Castillo was no longer surrounded by men with guns. Just walls. Still, even behind those walls he believed no one would dare touch him. He believed wrong. Because outside back in Colombia the tide was shifting. The poor were restless. Activists like Carlos Medina were rising, calling Álvaro's legacy what it truly was, a calculated reign of corruption. On social radio, Carlos declared, "This man paid for schools with the same hand that fed addiction. You cannot call that charity." Carlos was young, determined, not afraid. And Marcelo? He had been watching, waiting, seething. The man Álvaro once called his shadow was preparing to leave a wound the world wouldn't ignore. By the time Álvaro Castillo turned 64, he had built a fortress out of fear. But even fortresses crumble, not from outside attack but from the cracks within. The first crack was Marcelo Ortega. Once Álvaro's most trusted enforcer, Marcelo had begun to taste resentment like a slow poison. Álvaro had demoted him 3 years earlier, publicly without warning, after Marcelo was caught siphoning money from a shipping operation in Cadiz. Álvaro didn't kill him. That was the humiliation. Marcelo had expected a bullet. Instead he got silence. No execution. Just exile. He was sent back to Colombia with nothing but his title stripped and his pride intact enough to burn. That burned pride became obsession. Marcelo spent years watching from the edges. He built quiet alliances, offered protection to smaller rival gangs, and rekindled old loyalties Álvaro had long since taken for granted. He didn't need to act fast. Álvaro was getting older, slower, more trusting of the wrong people. Time, Marcelo believed, would do most of the work for him. But Marcelo wasn't the only one circling. In Bogotá, a storm of a different kind was forming, a political one. A 32-year-old activist named Carlos Medina had begun gathering momentum in national media. A lawyer-turned-journalist, Carlos was the son of school teachers who had fled Caqueta during Álvaro's peak years. His childhood had been shaped by the aftermath, missing relatives, corrupt local officials, and whispered warnings not to ask questions. But Carlos asked anyway. He returned to Caqueta in his late 20s, not to fight with bullets but with facts. He spent months collecting testimonies from former residents who had worked under Álvaro's rule. He interviewed grieving mothers, jailed men who had once trafficked under duress, even elderly priests who admitted taking Álvaro's donations while secretly praying for his demise. Carlos saw himself not as a hero but as a mirror, forcing the country to look at what it had let become invisible. On national radio he stated calmly, "When you reward a man for cleaning the house he set on fire, you're not building justice. You're feeding delusion." He knew the danger. But he didn't care. Each time Carlos appeared on television, Álvaro's name was mentioned with less awe and more scrutiny. That shift didn't sit well in Caqueta. Especially not with Beatriz Duarte. Beatriz had grown up in Álvaro's shadow, yet she was no mere ornament to his legacy. Educated abroad, at Álvaro's expense, she returned with an MBA and a sharp mind. Álvaro placed her in charge of managing the family's clean investments. Cattle farms, coffee plantations, tourism ventures along the Caqueta River. On paper she was a respected entrepreneur. But privately she was Álvaro's firewall. She moved money. She cleaned reputations. She kept the books closed to curious eyes. When Carlos Medina began gathering names for his exposé, Beatriz was the one Álvaro called. "Clean it up," he told her. She tried. Threats were made. Payments offered. But Carlos couldn't be bought. And that frightened her. Because in her heart, Beatriz knew something Álvaro refused to admit. This wasn't like before. This time they were losing the narrative. Meanwhile, in Spain, Álvaro's arrest was becoming less of a legal anomaly and more of a media fixation. He was being held in a private wing of the Severo Ochoa Hospital in Madrid, supposedly for heart complications. But everyone knew, this was house arrest dressed as humanitarian concern. He wasn't shackled. He received visitors. His lawyers came and went with the ease of diplomats. For all intents and purposes, Álvaro was still free, just in a different kind of palace. But freedom is fragile when your enemies are counting down your breath. Marcelo Ortega, back in Colombia, saw opportunity in Álvaro's vulnerability. He reconnected with old contacts in Spain, some of whom Álvaro had once cast aside or underpaid. He fed them a plan. It wasn't reckless. It was surgical. The idea was simple: remove Álvaro in public, and the illusion of his untouchability dies with him. Marcelo didn't care who replaced Álvaro. He didn't want the crown. He wanted the ghost gone. The man who made him kneel. While this silent mutiny unfolded in shadows, Álvaro remained confident. To him, Carlos Medina was a loud boy playing grown-up games. Marcelo was an old dog who had already failed. And Beatriz, his beloved Beatriz, was still the child who sat at his desk and played with paperweights while he made men disappear. But he missed the signs. He missed the nights Beatriz stayed too long at her office, combing through ledgers, whispering with lawyers not to protect him, but to distance herself from what she feared was coming. He missed the tone in her voice when she said, "Tio, things aren't like before." He missed the silence in Carlos's eyes during a televised interview, an eerie calm that no longer feared the consequences. He missed it all. Until it was too late. On the evening of January 7, 2009, the corridors of Severo Ochoa Hospital in Madrid were unusually quiet. The cold outside had pushed most visitors home early, and only a soft hum of machines and the shuffle of nurses broke the silence on the private floor where Álvaro Castillo was housed. His guards were posted but less alert. After all, Álvaro wasn't in a prison. He was in recovery, a heart patient, not a prisoner of war. Inside room 402, Álvaro sat in a recliner by the window, wrapped in a charcoal gray robe, staring into the cloud-covered dusk. His mind, though quiet, was not at ease. A new prosecutor had joined the Spanish legal team. Extradition papers were being reviewed again. Whispers had reached him, about Carlos Medina's rising campaign, about unrest back home, about people asking too many questions. But one name hadn't come up in a while: Marcelo Ortega. Not until that evening. Around 7:30 p.m., a hospital official escorted a man up the back elevator. Spanish authorities had approved the visit hours earlier. On paper, he was Santiago Rivas, brother of a former cartel member who had been captured near Murcia. He'd come to plead for Álvaro's intervention. But Álvaro knew better. The moment Marcelo stepped into the room, Álvaro leaned back slightly, eyes squinting not in fear, but amusement. "You've lost weight," Álvaro muttered in Spanish, almost smirking. Marcelo smiled. "You've lost everything." For 15 minutes they sat face to face, their voices low but charged. A nurse passed once and heard only fragments, nothing hostile but something simmering just beneath. Marcelo began the conversation with what sounded like a plea. His younger brother had been picked up by Interpol after a tip-off. The Spanish authorities wanted him to testify against Álvaro. He needed Álvaro's help. A lawyer. A contact. Anything. Álvaro waved it off. "If he talked, he's not my problem anymore." Marcelo's jaw twitched. "He didn't talk. He's 21. He's scared." Álvaro shrugged. "Then he shouldn't have entered my world. I don't clean after children." Silence. That was the final fracture. Marcelo stood, walked slowly toward the window as if taking in the skyline. Then he turned. There was no dramatic gesture. No shouted threats. Just a simple movement, a small pistol drawn from inside his jacket. 2 shots rang out. One to the chest. One just above the ribcage. Álvaro fell backward, hitting the armrest with a muted thud. Blood soaked into his robe before pooling on the linoleum floor. He didn't scream. He didn't reach for help. He just stared. Marcelo walked closer, bent down, and said quietly, "You destroyed more lives than this empire could ever save." Álvaro, lips trembling, eyes barely open, rasped back, "You lack my spine." Then silence. Marcelo turned, exited calmly through the service stairwell, and disappeared into Madrid's night. No alarms had been raised. No guards had reacted. By the time nurses entered the room, After noticing irregular vitals on a monitor, Álvaro was gone. A body, not a man. The illusion of his invincibility lay shattered beside a half-finished glass of water. News traveled fast. By sunrise the next morning, headlines across Colombia screamed the impossible. El Viejo assassinated in Spanish hospital. His body hadn't yet been repatriated when streets in Quito were filled with arguments, speculation, even quiet mourning. People who once feared him now debated what he had represented. In a crowded classroom in Florencia, a student whispered, "They say the man who killed him was once his brother." Another replied, "No. He was his shadow." In Bogotá, Carlos Medina was on air before noon. He didn't gloat. He didn't cheer. Instead, he delivered one line that captured the complexity of it all. A man dead does not heal a community. But perhaps it stops the bleeding. But it was Beatriz Duarte who would feel it the deepest. She was in her office when she received the call. No euphemisms. No delay. Just a message from a Spanish contact who spoke the words as if dropping a bomb in her chest. She didn't cry, not at first. She stood still, then reached for the photo on her desk. A much younger Álvaro holding her at age 7, both smiling under the Quito sun. In her next breath she made 3 phone calls. One to the family's legal team. One to her uncle's financial advisor. And one to a former government official who owed her uncle more than he'd ever admit aloud. She had learned from Álvaro. The game didn't stop when the king died. Back in Madrid, the investigation launched immediately. Surveillance footage was scrubbed. Witness lists compiled. Spanish officials tried to manage the media frenzy, but the question echoed in every press room. How does a man get murdered in a hospital under government custody? Authorities found Marcelo's discarded credentials in a nearby alley. Within 48 hours he was tracked to a safe house outside Toledo, an abandoned villa reportedly owned by an Italian contact with ties to arms trafficking. He didn't resist. When officers entered, Marcelo sat calmly, hands in view, almost relieved. Under interrogation he didn't deny it. "I killed him," he said plainly. "And I'd do it again." But his motives even then remained murky. When asked if he'd acted on behalf of another cartel, Marcelo laughed. "No one owns my conscience." Still doubt lingered. His timing. His access. The paperwork that got him into that hospital. Too clean. Too precise. Some believed Marcelo acted as the tip of a larger blade, one held by rival syndicates or betrayed allies. Others insisted it was personal, the final rupture of loyalty. But the truth, as always in Álvaro's world, was buried under years of blood, silence, and money. The news of Álvaro Castillo's assassination didn't just make headlines. It rewrote the unwritten rules in places where his name once silenced entire rooms. By January 9, 2009, 3 days after the murder, his face was everywhere. Newspapers in Bogotá, Madrid, Washington, and even Rome ran different versions of the same photo. Álvaro mid-sentence at a peace rally from 2004, eyes stern, suit pressed, hands slightly raised. To some, it was the face of a man who once offered a ceasefire. To others, a cold symbol of power and blood. But in Quito, where his empire was born, the reaction was quieter. More conflicted. In the town of San Vicente del Caguin, local shopkeeper Rosa Elena, who once sold Álvaro's men food in bulk, locked up early. Not out of fear but grief. "I knew what he did," she said to a neighbor. "But I also knew what he built. Not every monster looks like one." A group of teachers at the local high school canceled classes for the afternoon. Not out of respect, they insisted, but because half their students didn't show up. Some were home because their parents once worked under Álvaro's name, either directly or indirectly. Others were scared. They knew when a boss falls, others rise fast. And violently. In Florencia, the capital of the department, the local government issued a short press statement. It expressed regret for the unresolved legacy of Don Álvaro Castillo, and warned against retaliation. But retaliation was already in motion. By January 11, in a small farming community near El Doncello, 3 bodies were found face down in a river, hands bound with electrical cord. One wore a t-shirt printed with the phrase "Clean streets, clean names," a slogan Álvaro had once used when purging rivals from the trade routes in 2002. This wasn't coincidence. It was a message. The deaths weren't investigated publicly. Not in detail. Not in that part of the country. But everyone knew what they meant. Álvaro's empire wasn't just dissolving, it was breaking apart into smaller, sharper pieces. In Bogotá, President Carlos Medina called a press conference. He stood at a podium flanked by armed guards and declared Álvaro Castillo's death, a pivotal moment in the soul of Colombia. But what followed wasn't unity. It was calculation. His administration used the death as leverage. Within weeks, new legislation passed allowing for deeper government access to foreign financial records and international extradition deals. Allies praised it. Critics accused Medina of exploiting a corpse for political gain. Behind closed doors, a senior aide to the president was caught saying, "It's not that Álvaro is gone, it's that he left no heir we can't manage." They were wrong. Beatriz Duarte, Álvaro's niece, re-entered the narrative quietly. 2 weeks after the assassination, she flew to Madrid to identify the body, sign repatriation papers, and sit down with two people: Álvaro's longtime lawyer Ramón Torres, and an international financial auditor hired by Álvaro 6 months before his death. The meeting took place in a quiet hotel suite near Plaza de España. Ramón opened a briefcase and slid a USB drive across the table. "This has the full trust. In your name." Beatriz blinked slowly. "I'm not like him." Ramón nodded. "He knew that. That's why he chose you." The USB held not just money, but documents, foreign holdings, land titles under obscure shell companies in Panama, Canada, and Romania. There was a vineyard in Argentina. A private mining lease in the Democratic Republic of Congo. And somewhere buried in the files, code names linked to names she recognized from the Colombian Senate floor. Beatriz didn't want power. But now she held the map to what Álvaro left behind. Meanwhile in Madrid, Marcelo Ortega sat in a high-security holding cell. His trial hadn't begun. No plea entered. No bail offered. Spanish prosecutors were confused. They couldn't decide whether he was a lone gunman, a cartel agent, or something harder to define. A man broken by too much loyalty for too long. He rarely spoke. When he did, it wasn't about Álvaro. It was about trees. Silence. His mother. Psychiatrists examined him twice. Both times they concluded the same thing: Marcelo does not regret. He simply ended a chapter that haunted him. Spanish officials debated whether to extradite him to Colombia or prosecute locally. But neither happened quickly. Marcelo had become a symbol, and symbols make terrible courtroom defendants. Everyone had a stake in how he was portrayed. Back in Colombia, people were adjusting to a new era, one without the shadow of Álvaro Castillo. But the aftershocks were still happening in small, invisible ways. A land rights case in Putumayo suddenly halted when new property titles were submitted, bearing Álvaro's silent signature from 2007. A former general in Bogotá abruptly retired, citing stress, after an anonymous email leak suggested he'd been on Álvaro's private payroll for nearly a decade. And in Medellín, a 23-year-old street dealer named Iván was killed for using Álvaro's name in a tribute mural. He hadn't asked permission. The message was clear: whatever loyalty once shielded Álvaro's name was gone. The vultures were circling. And even in death, his influence could still get you killed. The Castillo Foundation, a quiet organization Álvaro had funded for years, shuttered its youth programs indefinitely. Some suspected the funds had dried up. Others believed it was precautionary. Beatriz had ordered the pause until she could ensure the money wasn't marked. In a rare move, El Tiempo, one of Colombia's oldest newspapers, ran a 2-page editorial with the headline, "What do we owe the devil we knew?" It wasn't flattery. It was reckoning. Because Álvaro Castillo hadn't just been a trafficker. He'd been an employer, a protector, a manipulator, a father figure, a villain, a strategist, and, for some, a savior. And now he was gone. Not in prison. Not on trial. But in a hospital room where his last words went unheard by the world. Beatriz Duarte had not seen her uncle Álvaro in nearly 4 years. Their last conversation was strained, not hostile. More like a chess match between two people trying not to show their next move. He had sent for her then, just after a failed peace negotiation with a rural faction he no longer trusted. He was tired. She could see that. The lines on his face had deepened. The charm still there but dulled. That day he asked her one question. "If I died tomorrow, would you protect me or bury me?" She didn't answer. She had walked out without looking back. But now, in a hotel suite in Madrid, with her name on offshore trusts and blood on the ledger, she had no choice. Beatriz had always existed on the edge of her family's power. She was not part of the business, but she was part of the silence. Her parents, Álvaro's younger brother and sister-in-law, had died in a car accident when she was 14. Álvaro paid for her education, bought her first car and later the apartment she lived in during law school in Bogotá. He had been generous. And generous men are hard to say no to, until you see the cost. She became a lawyer, then an international human rights consultant. Her world lived in reports and policy frameworks, not in cash transfers and burial plots. But Álvaro always lingered on the margins, an unwanted benefactor, a shadow at the end of each success. Now with him gone, the shadow had form. The documents she received were detailed, organized, even elegant. A web of properties, accounts, bearer bonds and cash flow sources dressed in neutral language, agricultural exports, consulting agreements, infrastructure partnerships. On paper, she was the controlling officer of Duarte Global Holdings, a Luxembourg-based entity valued at approximately $58.3 million USD. But she knew what every dollar cost, who it came from, whose lives it passed through. The first thing she did was freeze all withdrawals. Not out of fear. Out of control. She needed time. Back in Colombia, lawyers and accountants panicked. One firm, based in Cali, sent a cryptic warning. The clients who depended on Don Álvaro expect continuity. Uncertainty is a dangerous fuel. She didn't reply. Instead, she turned to someone who had once hated her uncle openly, Mateo Rios, a journalist whose work had been blacklisted during Álvaro's peak years. They met quietly at a bookstore in Medellin. Mateo was cautious but curious. She handed him a red folder with unmarked financial data. She said nothing. He said nothing back. But 3 days later, a headline appeared in an online publication he freelanced for, "What Álvaro Hid from Himself, the Ghost Network of Influence." It was the beginning of her soft war, against the legacy she had inherited and the expectation to preserve it. But fighting shadows is lonely work. In private, Beatriz couldn't sleep. She reread the letter Álvaro had left her, locked in the same USB drive that contained the trust files. It was written like a confession, but not of guilt. "You are not like me, and that is why I chose you. I built something too big. It will not disappear when I do. But someone should know where the exits are." She hated him for his clarity. She hated him for the trap disguised as trust. Meanwhile, in Colombia, factions that once answered to Álvaro began to split. One wing, based in Meta, tried to take over routes along the eastern corridor. Another, younger group began rebranding the trade under a new name, Los Nuevos Herederos, the New Heirs. Beatriz heard the name on a news broadcast while brushing her teeth. She spit out the foam and stared at herself in the mirror. She looked tired. She looked like someone she didn't recognize. She wondered, was this her now? The heir to a throne no one deserved? 2 weeks later, a courier delivered a package to her Madrid apartment. No return address. Inside, a flash drive and a single sentence typed on a slip of paper: "Decide. Or others will." The flash drive contained surveillance footage of her walking alone outside the bookstore with Mateo. Someone was watching her. Or more likely, many people were. Her lawyer, Ramon, warned her gently. "You're not invisible anymore. Whatever you do, make sure it doesn't look like fear." She understood. In her world, decisions were evidence. Hesitation was blood in the water. So she made one. On February 3, 2009, exactly 1 month after Álvaro's death, Beatriz Duarte issued a public statement. Short, formal, unshaking. "I will not participate in the financial continuation of the estate left to me by Álvaro Castillo. I will cooperate with international financial authorities to ensure that any assets derived from illicit origins are investigated and dissolved. The world must not inherit what it cannot hold accountable." The statement went viral. Some called her brave. Others called her foolish. Former allies of her uncle labeled her a traitor. One even left a voicemail on Ramon's phone: "Tell the girl she just set fire to a house she still sleeps in." But she slept better that night. Because the choice had been hers. And sometimes when your family builds empires on silence, the only rebellion left is telling the truth. Álvaro Castillo's death did not create a vacuum. It revealed one. 4 months before his assassination, his grip had already loosened. He was aging, sick, isolated in Europe. His former generals were either dead, imprisoned, or looking to buy their way into political circles. But no one said it aloud, not while he was still alive. His name still opened doors. It still inspired loyalty. It still caused silence in courtrooms. When the gunshots ended him, so did the illusion of control. Within days, the factions that once reported up the chain began acting on their own instincts. The first to rise was a young former logistics runner named Dario Mejia, born in Pitalito but raised in the urban grind of Neiva. Street-smart and media-savvy, Dario was not Álvaro's heir by blood, but he had once served him loyally as a regional courier. He called himself pragmatic. Others called him a traitor in waiting. Dario moved fast. Within 3 weeks, he convened a meeting with former mid-level commanders from Caqueta, Putumayo, and Guaviare. They met in a ranch house previously seized during a military raid, now reclaimed under Dario's control. He pitched a new vision, not an empire but a corporate alliance. No more visible kings. Just partners with routes and rules. No one needs a throne anymore, he told them. Just dividends. Some cheered. Others hesitated. They were still loyal to the image of Álvaro if not the man. But in the absence of structure they saw opportunity. Dario christened the group La Red del Sur, the Southern Network. Not a cartel, not a militia, just a business forum, as he called it, with weapons. Their brand was modern. Social media videos. Community cleanup drives. Quiet campaign donations to mayors in rural towns. They understood optics. They learned from Álvaro's mistakes. But not everyone agreed with the soft approach. From the eastern plains of Meta came a louder, bloodier voice. Tomás El Comandante Aguirre, a former paramilitary captain turned trafficker who had been exiled from Álvaro's circle after a botched shipment in 2005. Tomás saw Álvaro's fall not as a loss, but as a divine reset. He formed Los Nuevos Herederos, the new heirs. Their platform was brutal simplicity. Purge the old guard, seize abandoned routes and re-establish dominance through fear. Where Dario gave speeches, Tomás left severed fingers on doorsteps. Where Dario bought land, Tomás stole it. The two groups existed in uneasy proximity. Some areas saw both factions operating with tense tolerance. Other areas erupted in direct confrontation. One such region was San Vicente del Caguin, once a stronghold of Álvaro's political influence. Dario sent emissaries. Tomás sent men with rifles. In a span of 10 days, 4 councilmen disappeared. 2 journalists fled. The school was burned. And through it all, the people, the villagers, the farmers, the day laborers, watched, waited, and remembered. They remembered when Álvaro built clinics. When he paid for schoolbooks. When he negotiated peace between rival militias, if only to preserve his own trade routes. He ruled like a warlord, but sometimes he felt like a necessary one. Now, with him gone, what remained felt unpredictable. Fragmented. Dangerous. One old woman in El Doncello put it simply in an interview with a local paper. Before, we had a devil with manners. Now we have dogs with teeth. Back in Madrid, Beatriz read the reports with a numb heart. She had wanted to end something, not trigger 100 new beginnings. The European authorities reached out to her, asking if she had any information on successor groups. She offered what she could, but she knew her reach was symbolic. Carlos Medina, meanwhile, returned to Colombia after months abroad. His activism gained traction. Young people followed him online. He launched a podcast titled, After the Empire, documenting the rise of La Red del Sur and Los Nuevos Herederos. He interviewed locals anonymously, often at risk to their lives. In one episode he asked, when a tyrant dies, are we freed? Or are we just handed to his children? It struck a chord. But it also painted a target on his back. An anonymous tip reached a Bogotá newsroom. Carlos had been followed twice leaving his studio. His tires slashed. Surveillance footage deleted. He kept broadcasting. And then a name emerged that neither Dario nor Tomás expected. Lucia Vargas. Álvaro's illegitimate daughter. Raised in secrecy. Schooled in Brazil. Unknown even to Beatriz until a DNA-confirmed inheritance claim surfaced. Lucia wasn't a trafficker. She was a businesswoman, an economist by training with a sharp legal team and a deeper ambition. She wasn't interested in routes or guns. She wanted the money. The shell companies. The patents. The mineral licenses Álvaro had tucked into dummy corporations. The clean face of a dirty fortune. And she wanted it all legally. She filed suit in both Colombia and Spain, seeking recognition as next of kin. In her first public interview she said, I don't want his sins. I want what he tried to clean. Her emergence threatened everyone. Dario saw her as a liability, proof that Álvaro had hedged his bets. Tomás called her, a banker with lipstick. Beatriz quietly admired her resolve, but feared her timing. A third Vargas heir. One armed with lawyers, not guns. In the end, Álvaro's death didn't silence the world he built. It scattered it. Into factions. Into slogans. Into lawsuits and funerals and YouTube interviews. The throne was broken, but the pieces were still sharp. And everyone wanted one. The courtroom in Madrid was not grand. Not like the ones in movies. It was quiet. Functional. Beige walls, gray chairs, and the smell of coffee that had been reheated too many times. But what played out inside it was anything but ordinary. Marcelo Ortega, Álvaro Castillo's former lawyer and confidant, entered through the side door on the morning of October 14th. His posture had changed. Once upright, even arrogant, he now walked with a cautious humility, as if shrinking might save him. He wore no tie. His suit was clean but plain. He had cut his hair short, no longer the neatly groomed politician's assistant, but a man trying not to be noticed in the crowd. But there was no chance of that. Dozens of cameras lined the courthouse entrance. Protesters stood across the street. Some held signs with Álvaro's face scratched out. Others held up Beatrice's book. A few wore masks with Marcelo's likeness mocking him. Inside, the prosecution laid out their case. Money laundering, racketeering, obstruction of justice. Marcelo hadn't just helped Álvaro build the empire, he had shielded it, structured it, and defended it with surgical precision. The prosecutor, a tall, unsmiling woman named Maria Esteban, began with a simple sentence. Mr. Ortega was not a bystander. He was the architect of the silence. The courtroom sat in stillness. She presented emails, voice recordings, ledger entries showing payments to shell corporations in Cyprus, Panama, Luxembourg. Marcelo's signature was on nearly every document. His voice, cautious but clear, was heard coaching a junior associate on how to describe consulting fees without raising suspicion at the bank. But Marcelo had come prepared. He wasn't planning to deny everything. He was planning to shift. On the third day he took the stand. His voice was calm, deliberate. He spoke in Spanish, though an English translator was present for international media. I served Mr. Castillo because I believed he was the lesser evil in a time of chaos, Marcelo said. I never touched drugs. I never carried a weapon. I was a lawyer. A tool. That was my crime, obedience. There was a murmur in the gallery. Maria Esteban stood. Mr. Ortega, you didn't simply obey. You enabled. You advised. You filed patents for illegal mining. You arranged fake NGOs. You negotiated contracts between violent groups. You weren't a tool. You were the craftsman. Marcelo didn't flinch. But his eyes drifted, once, to the far right corner where Beatriz Vargas sat. She wore all black. Her arms crossed. No expression. That was the moment many would replay later, the glance. The weight in it. Beatriz had not spoken to him since the arrest. But now he was trying to speak through silence. In the weeks that followed, Marcelo's defense strategy became clear. He would confess, but selectively. He admitted to managing offshore assets, to concealing donations made to political candidates in Bogotá and Neiva. But he insisted he was never part of the drug operation. He claimed Álvaro had a separate team for that, men he called the Old Shadows. But Beatriz knew better. She had seen the signatures. She had seen the late-night messages. Marcelo had known more than he admitted, and he had done less than he should. Still, the court wasn't there to judge moral failure. They were judging criminal complicity. One key moment came when a former intern, now an anonymous whistleblower, testified by video from a hidden location. Marcelo once told me, "We don't defend Álvaro because he's innocent. We defend him because without him, everything collapses." That sentence hung in the courtroom like smoke. By the 6th week the mood changed. Reporters began to frame the trial not as a question of guilt, but of scale. How much had Marcelo really known? Was he the loyal soldier or the co-strategist? Could one man, even a brilliant lawyer, truly manage an empire that spanned continents? The defense called 2 character witnesses, former university professors and a retired judge who once worked with Marcelo. They painted him as principled. Misguided, maybe, but never malevolent. Beatriz was asked if she would testify. She declined. When pressed by the media outside the courthouse, she simply said, "If he needed me to speak for him, he should have spoken for me when I was 19 and terrified." It silenced the crowd. As closing arguments began, Marcelo's lawyers made one final plea. "My client is guilty of cowardice, not conspiracy." He buried his ethics under fear. But he was not the mastermind. He was a man in a burning house trying not to be consumed. But Maria Esteban disagreed. In her final address to the court, she held up the original trust agreement, the one that transferred assets from Álvaro to a Dutch holding company. Marcelo's signature was the first on the page. You don't sign away millions for a man unless you believe in his cause. Or you profit from it. On December 8th, the court recessed for deliberation. The verdict would take 2 weeks. During that time, speculation ran wild. Some believed Marcelo would get 10 years. Others thought 5 with time served. A few believed he'd walk. But Beatrice? She didn't care about the number. In her journal, later published in her second book, she wrote, "There is no sentence long enough to restore a life spent in silence. Marcelo won't pay for Álvaro's sins. No one will. Justice is not balance. It's just an attempt to remember." And so the world waited, again, not for a man to rise but for a system to speak. Long after Álvaro Castillo's empire collapsed, long after the trial of Marcelo Ortega closed its final file, the silence in the countryside remained. But it wasn't peaceful. It was the kind of silence that held back stories people had been too afraid to tell. In the town of La Candelaria, 50 kilometers from the Colombian border, Maria Inés, now 63, still opened her small bakery every morning at 4:30 a.m. Her hands, rough from decades of kneading dough, moved without hesitation. But her voice trembled when Álvaro's name came up. Her son Julian had vanished in 2014. He was 17. He wanted to be a teacher, she whispered. One day he didn't come home. No body. No goodbye. Nothing. Years later, through Beatrice's book and a leaked ledger from Álvaro's accountants, Maria learned Julian had been mistakenly recruited as a courier. He wasn't part of the cartel. He was a mule, likely discarded the moment he became inconvenient. No charges were ever filed in connection to his disappearance. There was no legal document tying him to the operation. Just a name scribbled in an expense report. Asset, J. Inés, operational support, $700. That's what Julian's life was worth on paper. Maria didn't want revenge. She wanted someone to say his name out loud. Someone to admit that he had mattered. In Neva, Luis and Andrea Romero, once prosperous coffee farmers, now ran a roadside fruit stall. They had been forced off their land in 2016 when Álvaro's subsidiary company forged a land title and claimed their hillside farm for a soil regeneration initiative. In reality, it became an airstrip for short-distance smuggling. "We went to the local mayor," Luis said. "He told us to forget it. That those hills belong to more powerful people now." They moved into a single-room shack with their 2 daughters. Their youngest, Natalia, now 12, didn't remember what a field of coffee smelled like. But she had memorized the names of the officials who had signed the documents to take it away. Beatriz later interviewed the Romeros for a documentary. When asked if they'd ever gotten an apology, Andrea just shook her head. There are no apologies in power. Only replacements. Justice for survivors didn't come in the form of prison sentences or news reports. It came, if at all, in fragments. An unsealed document, a reparations claim, a name acknowledged in a footnote. And most of the time it didn't come at all. In Santa Marta, Javier Camacho, a former civil engineer who had once overseen construction projects funded by Álvaro's development firm, now lived under a different name. He had turned whistleblower in 2020, submitting evidence to a Spanish investigative outlet detailing how government contracts were routed through fake companies tied to Álvaro's offshore accounts. He lost everything. His job. His passport. His father died while he was in hiding. People think it's noble to speak out. It's not, he said in a rare interview. It's expensive. It cost you your life piece by piece. But still he did it. Because silence was heavier than shame. Meanwhile, in Barcelona, the echo of Álvaro's empire still haunted the business sector. The offices of Castanova Holdings, once his European front, were sold off. But people who had once shaken his hand now denied ever meeting him. Investors rebranded. Politicians redacted speeches. One former cabinet minister who had publicly praised Álvaro's philanthropy now claimed she had been duped by charisma. But the survivors remembered. Every single one. In a makeshift community center built from scrap metal and cement on the outskirts of Medellín, Beatriz read aloud from her book one humid afternoon to a group of students. She didn't read the parts about courtrooms or legal filings. She read the letters. Letters from farm workers, from teachers who lost pensions when Álvaro's shell companies collapsed, from children who still wake up screaming because they remember the sound of trucks arriving in the middle of the night. One boy, no older than 11, raised his hand. "Is the bad man dead?" Beatrice paused. "No," she said gently. "But he's gone." The boy nodded and then asked, "Do we still have to be quiet?" She took a breath. "Not anymore." That's what the survivors were left with. Not compensation. Not closure. But the freedom to speak. Some did. Some didn't. Some never would. Because trauma doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers. And sometimes it says nothing at all. But in that silence, there were new voices rising. Journalists. Activists. Teenagers who quoted Beatrice's words like scripture. They weren't trying to tear down Álvaro's legacy. It had already collapsed. They were building something else entirely, a record. Because empires may fall, but the truth, once spoken, can never be buried again. The book arrived quietly without fanfare. No major publishing house announced its release. No primetime interviews. No billboard campaigns. Just a soft launch from a small independent press in Bogotá with a faded photo on the cover. A dirt road winding through Caqueta, under a sky that looked ready to collapse. Its title was simple, Bloodline, Letters from the Empire by Beatriz Duarte. At first, few understood the storm it would bring. The book was not a confession. It was not even an apology. It was, as Beatriz would later say, a reckoning with silence. A mosaic of memories, transcribed prison conversations, hospital visits, and old letters exchanged between her and Álvaro over 15 years. It blended fact and feeling, fury and longing. And it told the truth, not just about the man but about the world that allowed him to thrive. I did not write this to explain him, she wrote in the prologue. I wrote this so people would stop explaining him away. Inside were pages of handwritten notes Álvaro had scrawled while awaiting trial. His voice was still arrogant, still soaked in the entitlement of a man who had ruled by fear. But there were moments, small, brief, where his bravado cracked. They call me a monster, one letter read, but monsters only grow where no one pulls the weeds. Beatriz didn't defend him. But she didn't erase him either. She let him stand as he was. And in doing so she exposed the scaffolding that had held him up. Politicians, foreign banks, contractors, and even humanitarian aid groups that funneled money through his channels without asking too many questions. The reaction was immediate. Within a week, Bloodline topped non-fiction charts in Colombia and parts of Spain. Within 2, it was pulled from several stores in Madrid, after a group of retired officials claimed it posed a threat to public morale. Within a month, it was being quoted in UN discussions on transnational crime and cited in academic panels across Latin America. But the biggest shockwaves came not from scholars or lawmakers. They came from within the homes he'd once controlled. In towns like Florencia, San Vicente, and Puerto Rico, local youth gathered in schools and plazas to read chapters aloud. They created podcasts. They filmed homemade documentaries. They painted murals of the victims Beatriz had named, people the courts had never acknowledged. For them, the book became more than a memoir. It became a mirror, forcing entire communities to confront what had been buried under years of survival. In one viral video, a teenager named Daniel stood in front of a mural and held up the book. My uncle worked for Castillo. My cousin disappeared after refusing to. This book doesn't fix that. But it makes it real. And real is better than silence. Not everyone welcomed the reckoning. In Bogotá, a former regional governor filed a defamation lawsuit against Beatriz, claiming the book endangered national reconciliation. A business magnate in Barcelona, whose company was named in a footnote, threatened to sue the publisher for false insinuations. Armed graffiti appeared outside Beatriz's apartment. Loyalty has no expiry date. She moved 3 times in 6 months. But she didn't stop speaking. In public readings she often repeated the same line, "You cannot kill a name. You can only decide which version of it will survive." And survive it did. Because the more they tried to silence it, the louder it became. A month after its release, Carlos Medina, the activist who once led marches against Álvaro from a local radio booth, wrote an op-ed titled, "The Niece Who Spoke First." In it, he admitted something few had been willing to: we all watched the empire grow. Some benefited. Some resisted. But most of us just lived under it, too afraid to look up. Beatriz did not redeem her uncle. She did something harder. She told the truth knowing it would hurt her too. That was the book's power. Not that it exposed secrets but that it made people feel responsible, for their silences, their hesitations, their compromises. Within a year, international NGOs launched 2 investigations into financial networks tied to Álvaro's legacy. Spain reopened inquiries into contracts from the 2000s. Colombia's Truth Commission added 6 of Beatriz's named victims to their formal record. And families, previously ignored, were finally heard. For Beatriz the cost was personal. She lost friends. Distant cousins cut ties. Some accused her of betrayal. Others of profiteering. But when asked if she regretted it, she shook her head. "I wasn't trying to save him," she said during an interview in Medellin. "I was trying to save myself from becoming just another person who knew and said nothing." In 2023, Bloodline was translated into 8 languages. A film adaptation was greenlit. Beatrice refused to sell the rights unless survivors were paid as consultants. She didn't want fiction. She wanted memory. Because memory was the only thing the empire had failed to control. And in that memory, Álvaro Castillo was no longer just a feared name whispered in hallways or glorified in narco-folklore. He was a man, flawed, brutal, charismatic, manipulative, and accountable. And thanks to Beatrice, the world finally knew him not through rumor or report, but through the eyes of someone who loved him, and still chose to reveal him. The empire was gone. The buildings had new owners. The trucks bore different logos. The bank accounts were frozen, the offshore shelters slowly dismantled. Álvaro Castillo was no longer a name whispered in fear but debated in classrooms, investigated in courtrooms and dissected in books. But he still lingered, in memories, in mannerisms, in the choices people made when no one was watching. The ghosts didn't wear uniforms. They didn't come with threats. They came quietly, wearing the face of shame, silence, or guilt. Beatrice knew this more than anyone. Even after the book, after the interviews, after the ceremonies where she sat beside weeping families and handed them pages marked with their loved ones' names, she would still wake up at 3 a.m. in a cold sweat, unsure if she had betrayed him, or finally seen him clearly. Her therapist called it survivor's responsibility. A complicated, lonely weight. Not just for surviving but for being born on the right side of power, for being offered safety by a man who denied it to others. She described it like a second spine, always there, holding her upright but never letting her rest. "I carry his last name," she once said. "And no matter how loud I speak, it echoes back with his voice too." But it wasn't just her. In small towns across Colombia, Álvaro's ghost took different forms. For Mariela, a 56-year-old teacher from Caqueta whose husband disappeared in 2008, it was the sound of gravel under tires at night. Even though Castillo's convoys no longer roamed the hills, she still jumped every time she heard that crunch outside her window. For Mateo, a 30-year-old lawyer working with a victims' reparations program, the ghost showed up in paperwork. In one case file after another, he saw how bureaucracy folded over truth, how missing names were labeled unverified, how families were asked to prove pain with receipts. "Sometimes I wonder if justice was built to finish what Castillo started, just with pens instead of guns," he once said. And for Elena, a former lover of Álvaro's who never spoke publicly until years later, the ghost lived in her daughter's face. "She has his eyes," she told a documentary crew in 2024. "And every time she blinks, I remember the night he told me I could either stay or disappear. I stayed. But a part of me still vanished." These stories weren't unique. They were stitched into the country's skin, like old scars beneath new clothes. The economy had moved on. Politicians had pivoted. Younger generations joked about the past on TikTok, making memes out of men who once terrorized villages. But beneath the laughter there was rot. Because Álvaro had taught a generation that power didn't need legitimacy, it just needed loyalty. That rules were optional. That silence could be bought. That fear was more effective than fairness. And even in his absence that lesson endured. In 2025, a new scandal broke, this time in the private security sector. A group of former Castillo enforcers had quietly been rehired under new names, guarding luxury condos and political retreats. When exposed, the companies claimed they had no idea who the men were. But records showed otherwise. Some had even used reference letters from former mayors. The press called it the Shadow Network. But to survivors it was no surprise. "Empires don't end when the leader dies," a columnist wrote. "They end when the mindset dies." And Castillo's mindset is still in business. It was everywhere, in the bribe a cop took to ignore a checkpoint, in the way a judge delayed a ruling for the right phone call, in the developer who bulldozed indigenous land without consequence. Different players. Same playbook. Even abroad the echo was felt. In Spain, where Castillo once moved money through shell companies, a university professor resigned after it was revealed that her entire research fund was tied to a grant issued through a former affiliate. In the US, a tech startup unknowingly hired a former Cartel accountant who had rebranded as a blockchain consultant. When a journalist connected the dots, the company folded in under a week. The world had changed. But it hadn't healed. And for Beatrice this was the hardest truth. That telling the story wasn't enough. That for every person who read her book and wept, there were others who skimmed it and said, "Yes, but what about the good he did?" As if roads and hospitals could excuse graves. Still she kept going. She created a foundation in her uncle's name, but not to honor him. To expose him. It funded investigative journalism, trauma counseling, and forensic searches in rural regions where families still waited for bodies that never returned. She named it Echo, a reminder that the past never disappears. It only repeats if ignored. And slowly the echoes began to change. Children born after Castillo's fall began asking different questions. They didn't just want to know who he was. They wanted to know why no one stopped him sooner. They were less interested in fear, more interested in justice. They weren't trying to forget. They were trying to understand. And maybe that's where the ghost began to fade. Not through denial. Not through punishment. But through reckoning. Through classrooms that taught the full story. Through plaques that named the nameless. Through voices that didn't tremble when they said, "I remember." Because ghosts only live in the dark. And in the light, painful, unflinching, honest, they begin to lose their shape. In the years following Álvaro Castillo's fall, Colombia confronted a question both judicial and moral. How do you charge a society for its complicity? The first formal step arrived quietly in Bogotá on a rainy November morning. A special tribunal, part of the nation's Truth Commission, unveiled its findings on transnational criminal accountability. It named not only the Kingpin who died in Madrid, but the web of officials, businesses, and institutions that had enabled him. For survivors like Maria Inés, the moment held significance. Her son Julian's name, once a footnote in an expense ledger, appeared in the tribunal's final report. That acknowledgement carried weight heavier than any prison sentence. "I don't need justice under a judge's gavel," she said. "I need the world to say his name was never stolen." The tribunal recommended sweeping reforms, asset redistribution, redirect frozen funds into community reparations and rebuilding projects. Public registry, a searchable database of all individuals and companies implicated, open to journalists and citizens. Judicial outreach, mobile court units dispatched to rural areas, ensuring families could testify without traveling miles. But the true reckoning came not from laws but from a cultural shift. In universities, courses were revamped to include modules on illicit economies and social responsibility. Students dissected Álvaro's network alongside Colombia's coffee oligarchs, questioning how legal and illegal fortunes had coexisted. In local governments, mayors inaugurated Silence Breaker Awards, recognizing citizens who took personal risks to expose corruption. One recipient was a 24-year-old teacher in Puerto Rico, the town, who had filed dozens of land trespass claims based on maps included in Beatrice's book. Meanwhile, Echo Foundation, Beatriz Duarte's initiative, launched a nationwide campaign called Names First, urging Colombians to record oral histories of those lost to the drug trade. Mobile vans with recording booths toured plazas, collecting stories that would otherwise vanish. These efforts forced Colombians to reckon with the human cost of greed, and to dismantle the culture of silence that had birthed it. In Spain, justice took on a different form. The Madrid court found Marcelo Ortega guilty of second-degree murder and money laundering. He was sentenced to 17 years, with the possibility of early release only after cooperating fully in ongoing investigations into his former associates. During his sentencing, the presiding judge, Maria Fernandez, addressed him directly. "You ended a life. You also held it in your hands for decades. You owed more than allegiance. You owed accountability." Marcelo stood, expression unreadable, and simply replied, "I have no words that fit." His sentence became a barometer for Europe's stance on transnational crime. It signaled that even in foreign soil, a man could be held responsible not only for a single act of violence, but for the network of abuses he enabled. Back in Colombia, political fallout was unavoidable. Two former ministers whose names appeared in leaked emails resigned. A cabinet reshuffle ensued. Journalists who once whispered in back offices now wrote front-page exposés. But the biggest change was ideological. For decades, the public had accepted a narrative: we are innocent bystanders. Now that myth was shattered. In Medellín, a graffiti artist painted a mural titled La Verdad Canta, The Truth Sings. It depicted Álvaro's silhouette breaking apart into the faces of the victims he had created, and the survivors who refused to be forgotten. The mural went viral, sparking copycats in towns across Latin America. Yet reckoning is never complete. In 2024, a by-election in Caqueta saw a former community organizer, Valeria Soto, win a seat in the national legislature. She ran on a platform built entirely on post-Castillo accountability, pledging to audit every land title transfer, every public contract, every auction of seized assets. Her victory illustrated a new truth: Colombians were no longer asking who killed Castillo, but who will rebuild with us? For Beatriz, watching from Madrid, the moment was bittersweet. She had triggered this cascade, Yet she remained an outsider in her own country, half celebrated, half suspected. At a university forum, a student asked her, "Do you think we're done?" Beatrice paused, then answered, "We're never done. Reckoning is not a destination. It's a living process. Every time someone speaks up, every time a family tells its story, the reckoning deepens." In courtrooms, classrooms, and coffee shops, Álvaro Castillo's name still carries weight. But the weight has changed. No longer a shadow that demanded silence, it has become a lens through which Colombia examines its past and shapes its future. Because at the heart of every empire's fall is a simple truth: power demands accountability, or it demands oblivion. And in a country determined to choose the former, the reckoning continues. By 2025, 15 years after Álvaro Castillo's death, the dust had settled, but the scars had not. Colombia had changed, yes. But it was the quiet, often invisible changes, the ones carried in hearts, homes, and humble community halls, that marked the true beginning of something new. In Florencia, the old Castillo estate, once surrounded by armed guards and luxury cars, had been converted into a youth cultural center, its gates now open. Inside, teenagers who once idolized El Viejo as a neighborhood legend were now learning film editing, coding, and poetry. The first poem ever read on the center's new stage was titled, "I Am Not My Father's Silence." It was written by Juliana Ortega, Marcelo's estranged daughter. Though she had long avoided the public eye, Juliana had returned to Colombia after studying abroad. She didn't defend her father, nor did she vilify him. Instead, she chose to redefine him, through art, through nuance. "My father killed a man," she said. "But before that he served one. And before that he was just another boy trying not to drown in power." Her words struck a nerve. In a country where revenge often wore the mask of justice, Juliana's choice to engage rather than run offered something rare: dignity without denial. Meanwhile, Carlos Medina, the once fiery activist, had become a seasoned leader. No longer shouting into microphones, he now facilitated dialogue circles in towns that had been cartel strongholds. The goal wasn't to name enemies. It was to help communities remember how to trust. In one session in San Vicente del Caguin, a former cartel courier sat across from a woman whose husband had died in a territorial ambush. They didn't hug. They didn't cry. But they spoke. And they stayed in the room. For Carlos, that was enough. "Forgiveness isn't the goal," he explained. "Clarity is. And from clarity, healing might eventually grow." His approach had inspired copycat programs in Venezuela, Ecuador, and even parts of Spain. And then there was Beatriz Duarte, forever walking between two worlds. Her memoir, Blood, Borders, and Beads, had been translated into 7 languages. In it, she wrote candidly about Álvaro's duality: the uncle who bought her books when no one else could afford shoes, and the man whose decisions ended hundreds of lives. She didn't romanticize him. She humanized him. And that distinction was what gave her words weight. In an interview with a Dutch reporter, she was asked, "Do you miss him?" She paused, then answered, "I miss what he could have been if no one had called him king." Beatrice had chosen not to profit from the memoir's success. Every royalty check went into the Echo Foundation, now expanded into 10 regions. Its motto, "Memory is Justice," appeared on murals, school notebooks, even public buses. Her latest project, digitizing testimonies from survivors in Caquita, so their stories wouldn't die in whispered conversations or forgotten letters. She knew redemption didn't come from monuments. It came from making sure no one had to suffer in silence again. In a small corner of Madrid, Marcelo Ortega sat quietly in a prison library. After years of silence, he had agreed to be interviewed for a prison rehabilitation program. He didn't speak in long paragraphs. His answers were clipped, sparse. But when asked why he pulled the trigger that night, his voice cracked slightly: "Because I thought killing him would stop the cycle. But it didn't. It just made it mine." He spoke not with pride, but with resignation. Marcelo was no longer a man seeking redemption. He was a man accepting that he might never get it, and trying to live with that. He had become a cautionary tale, not a hero. But perhaps that too was a kind of renewal. And across Colombia, quiet changes bloomed. Former sicarios became soccer coaches in Medellin. A group of widows opened a bakery called Pan de Esperanza, Bread of Hope, in Caquita, with profits going to children of disappeared victims. A radio program called Second Names helped people reclaim their lost relatives by restoring their full identities on air. All of it, brick by brick, became part of the architecture of a new Colombia. One not defined by denial nor by revenge, but by the simple, stubborn act of rebuilding what violence tried to erase. Redemption, it turned out, wasn't a courtroom verdict. It wasn't a confession or a book deal or even a social program. That it was a mosaic made of thousands of moments, small, human, real, where people chose not to repeat the past, even when doing so might have been easier. It was a mother hugging a child without fear. A teenager who turned down a job offer from a man with fast cars and slower morals. A muralist painting a victim's name beside a flower instead of a gun. It was every decision made in the light. Álvaro Castillo had been gone for over a decade, but in the streets of Caqueta, his shadow still moved. Power, true power, doesn't vanish with death. It lingers. It mutates. It looks for new skin to wear. And after Álvaro's assassination, that search began immediately. His trafficking routes, once tightly controlled and loyally defended, splintered within months. Mid-level commanders, those who had once deferred to him without hesitation, suddenly saw opportunities, and chaos for a time reigned. Small towns like El Doncello and Puerto Rico, long used as trafficking corridors, became battlegrounds. Not grand wars with televised explosions, but silent, persistent tension. One group claimed a route, another retaliated by bribing the same local police chief. A truck went missing, a body appeared on the roadside, and no one claimed responsibility. The tragedy was not just in the violence, but in the quiet normalization of it. When Álvaro was alive there were rules, one local mechanic whispered. They were terrible rules, yes, but at least we knew them. Now, no one knows who's in charge. And with leadership fractured, opportunists stepped in. Cartels from Mexico, particularly the Sinaloa network, sent emissaries. They didn't arrive in convoys or with loud threats. They came as investors, offering cash to desperate locals, promising protection to those who felt abandoned. Some towns welcomed them, tired of instability. Others resisted, only to find their leaders gone overnight. The idea of the good narco resurfaced in whispers. Not as admiration but as longing. People who had once criticized Álvaro's rule now admitted, quietly, that his absence had brought more confusion than clarity. Beatriz Duarte, watching from Bogotá, called it the grief of structure. "My uncle built a corrupt empire," she said in an interview. "But he also filled a vacuum left by the state. When he died, that vacuum didn't heal. It widened. And now it's devouring what little peace we had." In Florencia, a new figure emerged, Miguel El Rastro Paredes, barely 28, known for flashy social media posts and cryptic videos with Bible quotes over rap beats. Unlike Álvaro, Miguel didn't seek reverence. He sought virality. He branded his operation not as a cartel, but as a logistics network. He funded concerts, sponsored boxing events, and posted motivational quotes about discipline and loyalty. He rarely addressed drugs directly, but those in the know understood what powered his rise. Carlos Medina, by now an advisor to Colombia's Ministry of Youth Recovery, warned that Miguel wasn't Álvaro's successor. He was something worse. Álvaro ruled with fear. Miguel rules with distraction. And that makes him harder to see, and harder to stop. Meanwhile, in rural communities the impact of the vacuum was more subtle. In one farming village near Cartagena del Chira, residents went 3 months without a local schoolteacher. The ministry had assigned one, but she left within a week, after hearing rumors that rival groups had recruited students as lookouts. In her absence, an elderly woman named Dona Estela volunteered to teach reading under a mango tree. When asked why, she simply said, "If we don't teach them to read, someone else will teach them to kill." Her words, soft as they were, cut deeper than any indictment. In Spain, where Álvaro had died, echoes of the power vacuum arrived too. Spanish police reported that Colombian trafficking had become more fragmented, but more aggressive. Smaller cells operated independently, often clashing with Italian and Balkan networks. Álvaro's old Madrid corridor was now a point of turf war, not just for drugs but for control over migration routes and arms trades. Marcelo Ortega, from his prison cell, read the news silently. During his limited phone privileges he once told a social worker, "I thought killing him would give us all a breath. I didn't know it would open the floodgates." The moral reckoning that followed Álvaro's death was real. But so too was the structural decay. His empire had been brutal, but it was an empire. It came with systems, order, expectations. Without it, those left behind faced a new reality. One where chaos filled the space that justice failed to reach. Beatriz Duarte was asked whether she feared Miguel El Rastro would rise to her uncle's level. She shook her head. "He won't. Because the world has changed. Social media doesn't build empires. It builds illusions. But illusions, she admitted, can still pull in the young. In the end, what Álvaro left behind wasn't just violence or corruption. He left a blueprint of how to exploit the needs of the forgotten. And unless those needs are addressed, not with speeches but with schools, jobs, and dignity, there will always be another Álvaro. Another Marcelo. Another Beatriz caught between grief and guilt. The void Álvaro left wasn't only his. It belonged to a country struggling to decide what to build where an empire once stood. The house where Álvaro Castillo was born still stands. It sits on a modest hill near San Vicente del Caguin, surrounded by dry grass and rusted barbed wire. The shutters are gone. The paint, a faint green from another era, peels like old skin. Children pass by it every morning on their way to school, barely glancing at it. To them it's just a crumbling house. They've heard the name Álvaro, yes, but only in fragments, in adult whispers and warnings not to ask too many questions. Time, it turns out, is the best silencer. Inside the house, the dust settles thick on the floor. A cracked photograph still hangs in one corner. Álvaro as a boy, standing next to his mother, holding a slingshot. Before the drugs. Before the deals. Before the blood. Someone once spray-painted the words, "Aquí nació un demonio," across the front wall. Someone else later covered it with white paint. No one knows who did either. It's easier not to claim things these days. Beatriz Duarte returned to the region 5 years after her uncle's death. Not to claim land or titles. Not to apologize. But to see it all with her own eyes. She didn't call the press. She didn't wear black. She walked through the town like anyone else, eating empanadas from street vendors, chatting with old women in the square. She asked a local priest about the schools. She asked a group of teenagers what they wanted to be when they grew up. Their answers didn't surprise her. Mechanic, footballer, rapper, or maybe just gone. That last one stayed with her. In a private conversation with a teacher, Beatriz asked if Álvaro's name still had weight. The teacher, an older man with calloused hands and tired eyes, looked down at the ground for a long moment before saying, "It doesn't weigh. It haunts." In Madrid, where Álvaro's life had ended, the headlines stopped mentioning him years ago. New scandals took his place. New kings of the underworld rose and fell. Spain moved on. But in Colombia, his legacy remained scattered, like ashes in the wind. Some were trying to bury it. Others were still breathing it in. In Bogotá, a university class debated the ethics of memorializing violent figures. Álvaro's name came up. One student argued that even monsters deserve to be studied. Another said studying him gives him more life than he deserves. No one could agree. But everyone felt the chill of his shadow. Marcelo Ortega died in prison before ever finishing his sentence. Some said he was poisoned. Others whispered he died of shame. He left no note. No public confession. No request for forgiveness. Just a line in a report, cardiac arrest. Age 58. The man who once moved millions in secret now lay in a public grave, marked only by a plastic tag and a number. If justice was served, it had been served cold. Years later, a young journalist named Camila Rojas wrote a book about Álvaro. Not to glorify him, she insisted, but to understand the systems that birthed him. Her book, The Map of Silence, didn't focus on the gunfights or the mansions. It focused on the towns with no hospitals. The teachers who went unpaid. The police who took bribes because their own children were hungry. She argued that Álvaro didn't create the darkness. He filled it. "You want fewer Álvaros?" she wrote. "Then build more bridges than walls. More schools than prisons. More truth than fear." The book sparked controversy. Some called her naive. Others called her brave. She didn't care for either label. She just wanted people to stop whispering. In the years that followed, Caquita changed, not because of one man's death, but because enough people finally said, "No more." Mayors stopped taking calls from shadowy donors. Farmers stopped growing coca and turned back to cacao, even when the profit was slower. Young men started joining local cooperatives instead of militias. And women, mothers, teachers, shopkeepers, began organizing not just for safety but for dignity. The healing was uneven. It was slow. But it had begun. Not with banners. Not with applause. But with decisions, quiet, relentless ones. And Álvaro? He faded. Not all at once but piece by piece. His name was eventually removed from the unofficial list of untouchable ghosts in Caquita. His family no longer paid for protection. His old house was repurposed into a shelter for children displaced by violence. When the ribbon was cut, Beatriz didn't attend. but she donated the first bookshelf. In the end, Álvaro Castillo's story didn't end with a bullet in Madrid or an empire in Colombia. It ended in the places where his name no longer frightened children, where silence no longer reigned, where people finally chose to remember what he took, so they could build what he never gave. And that, perhaps, is the quiet miracle of memory. It doesn't just preserve, it also protects, even from men like him.